Hello to everyone, I'm Leticia de las Vecillas, an allergist from Spain and the GM representative of the interest group Allergy Diagnosis and Precision Medicine at the ACI. Today, I have the pleasure to interview Professor Szepfalusi, Head of Pediatric Pulmonology and Allergology Section at Medical University of Vienna, Austria. We will talk about his recently published article in Pediatric Allergy and Immunology PAI journal entitled Lessons from Low Seroprevalence of SARS-CoV-2 Antibodies in School Children, a cross-sectional study. Welcome, Professor Szepfalusi, and thank you for joining us today to discuss your recent publication, an overview of SARS-CoV-2 infection in children. Please, could you explain us the rationale of this study?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to tell about our study that we recently published. Actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, my colleague, Professor Frischer, and me, we discussed how we could contribute to this unmet situation about the question how kids or children and adolescents would be spreader of the disease. If you can remember, or many of you could remember, that children were said to be the mildly affected potential super spreader. And so we were interested to know how the prevalence of PCR positive or seropositive kids would be in school children. And so we approached school authorities and we asked whether they would be interested, and they were interested. And then we came out to set up this study. Finally, the school authorities were approaching the school directors of the different schools, and when the school directors were interested, they approached their school teachers, and school teachers then approached the parents in the school classes or through the school classes. So this was the recruiting process. So it was quite on voluntary basis. And actually, it depended a little bit on the way how the school directors and the school teachers were interested themselves. Some denied to support, others were very interested. And finally, so we could gather a high number of children, adolescents, and small children, all school-age children, in the number of 2,069 at the end. And so we could perform our study as planned with a swab of an oropharyngeal and a nasal swab in addition to a blood drawing. And by that way, we could achieve to find 2 cases of PCR positive kids, notably 0.1%. and prevalence, and 26 cases of seropositivity, which is 1.3%. All these numbers were quite comparable to the numbers that we had at that time in adult populations.
Thank you very much for your answer. The next question that we have is, how do you think this study could impact the current scholar restrictions due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very important question. Actually, we had a lot of discussions how to interpret our data. And actually what I missed to tell you, and I will tell you right now, is the observation which was given by the fact that we allowed siblings to also participate to these investigations. So we had the chance to have a lot of siblings of one family included into the study. And out of this many siblings of one family, we could draw a kind of contact tracing picture. And we could define 3 different clusters out of these 26 families. And one cluster was defined by many other family members being tested positively for SARS-CoV-2. So father or mother or grandparents. This was one cluster. The second cluster was defined by no parents infected and no siblings infected, but information on intergenerational contacts that would be the transmitter such as the school teachers at that time. And the third group, the third cluster, were families where we could not figure out the persons or the individuals who would have transferred the disease or the virus. And actually, by this process, we found out that although we had a lot of siblings of one family, we had the impression that almost just one kid was positive in the family. And although they lived in the same surrounding with their siblings, there would be no transfer of the infection of the virus within the families from one kid to another child, which was quite astonishing because, I mean, they are living quite very close to each other. Some would share the same bed, and at least they share the same rooms, but they don't transfer the disease that easily as we would have thought at that time. This was one of the very important findings of our study, actually. Yes, I mean, how this would be transferred to the policy in the school. Actually, I mean, our impression was that obviously out of our study, and there were some other studies as well going into the same direction, our impression was that the transmission of the disease would not so much happen from one child to the other, as opposed to the hypothesis that it would come much more likely from adults and from intergenerational contacts from this side to the kids rather than from the kids' side to the adults. So this was more our impression of our study, but it was also supported by other studies at that time.
Thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Szepfalusi. The results of the article are really, really interesting. And to the last question, to summarize, would you please provide a couple of take-home messages?
Yes, I mean, the first take-home message would be that such a study, although it's very demanding to manage it, was quite easily done. I mean, we had some hurdles to pass, but actually it was easily done by the acceptance by the parents and the kids. So the population was at that time very prepared to come to this study, to be interested, to know and to help and to do and to accept what happens. Normally with kids studies or pediatric studies, it's much more complicated to find accepting parents. So this was a take-home message. When the population is ready and is interested, it goes easily. And this was the case in this study. I mean, the second observation is that kids were not more, but not less affected than adults at that time. Of course, the data now would be quite different, that they would be much higher than at that time at the very beginning, or more like at the beginning of this pandemic. So there was no difference in the prevalence, in the seroprevalence and in the PCR prevalence of the disease at that time of the first wave of the pandemic between children and adults. The third, and I would say the most important take-home message, is the fact of transmission from one child to the other child in the same family. By this potential that we had to have a lot of kids, a lot of siblings of the same family in this study, we had this particular possibility to observe that a transmission from one child to the other child in the same family would not likely happen as opposed to what we would have thought, because living side by side with a sibling, we would have expected that the disease, or at least the virus, would be jumping from one child to the other. And this was obviously not the case. And this would have or could have implications for our policy management in the schools as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Szepfalusi, for the interview. And we really encourage the audience to read the full text of your article. Thank you very much.
Thank you.